Welcome to the Crawlcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 18 of the NFL season. The first game is the Baltimore Ravens versus the Cleveland Browns. The Ravens won 35-10. The Ravens' leading passer is Lamar Jackson, who threw for 217 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Derrick Henry, who had 138 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Rashad Bateman, who had 76 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Browns, their leading passer is Bailey Zappi, who had 170 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was D'Onta Foreman, who had 27 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Jerry Jeudy, who had 63 receiving yards. So throughout this game, initially it was pretty close, where the Ravens' offense was just shut down by the Browns' defense. But it was just a sad, pitiful performance by the Browns' offense. They were kind of just swapping through Bailey Zappi and Dorian Thompson-Robinson. Neither of them could do anything, and eventually the Ravens turned it on towards the end, and they could not stop Derrick Henry. But overall, it was a good showing by the Browns' defense. It is going to be interesting whether or not Myles Garrett wants to stay. Because, again, the defense did pretty decent for most of the game. It's just that their offense was non existent. You are stuck with Deshaun Watson, so that's a problem. But, so that's going to be the big question whether Myles Garrett will stay or not. The next game is the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals won 19-17. The Bengals' leading passer is Joe Burrow, who threw for 277 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Khalil Herbert, who had 69 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Ja'Marr Chase, who had 96 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Steelers, their leading passer is Russell Wilson, who had 148 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Najee Harris, who had 36 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Pat Freiermuth, who had 85 receiving yards and a touchdown. So in this game, it was mostly the Bengals game the entire game, and then towards the end, the Steelers started to come back. Russell Wilson basically was just non-existent in this game. He needs to play better come playoff time. And then George Pickens, it was a real disastrous game for him. He only had 1 catch for 0 yards, and he had, I can't remember, either it was 3 or 4 drops. He was just absolutely horrible. And the Steelers' defense did do okay at times, and that's what they've been relying on, is their defense the entire season. And it's just that their offense really let them down to the point where I think they may even consider Justin Fields, because during this 4-game losing streak, Russell Wilson really has not been playing well, and it's been a huge disappointment for the Steelers. And the Bengals, they just started off the season slow. Unfortunately, they did miss the playoffs. I know they were trying to do a miracle run right at the end here, and it just didn't work out for them because the Broncos won. But overall, the Bengals, at least you finished strong. I don't think they should fire Zach Taylor. I think he's been a pretty decent coach. And overall, the Steelers, they need to fix something quick come playoff time. And the Bengals, Joe Burrow had an MVP season. He was really, really great. And it's just unfortunate that a couple of early losses early on cost them the playoffs. The next game is the Chicago Bears versus the Green Bay Packers. The Bears won 24-22. The Bears' leading passer is Caleb Williams, who had 148 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is DeAndre Swift, who had 65 receiving yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is DJ Moore, who had 86 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Packers, their leading passer is Malik Willis, who had 136 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Emmanuel Wilson, who had 73 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Malik Heath, who had 53 receiving yards. So in this game, it was kind of a bad performance on both sides. The Bears really weren't looking good or looking like anything special, and then the Packers, it felt like they made a lot of key mistakes. Jayden Reed had a key fumble, Malik Willis had a key fumble, and just neither of these teams really looked that good. The Packers, at least on the bright side for them, they did bench a lot of players, so it felt like they weren't really trying. Anyone who was even slightly injured did not play. And then Christian Watson unfortunately goes down. It looks like he probably tore his ACL and is going to be done for the year. That is just very unfortunate. And I get what the Packers are doing. They're playing their starters for a half and then benching them. But overall, I just think that was a bad move. You should have just benched them all the way. And it sucks for the Packers because, I believe it's been nearly 6 years since they lost to the Bears, and that streak finally comes to the end. And then the Bears, even though they didn't really play that well, they at least got a win. They broke their 10-game losing streak. And Caleb Williams is probably still the guy. Thomas Brown clearly is not the coach of the future, and so it'll be interesting who their next coach is. It'll probably be Ben Johnson, and I do think the Bears can be a decent team with decent coaching. Just they allow really close games, and I think with a little bit better coaching, they could do well. And the Packers, I'm kind of looking at a little bit of a blank slate because they weren't really trying to win this game. Again, they benched their starters for quite a bit. Jordan Love did get a bit banged up, but overall, the Packers just need to do better come playoff time. It feels like normally coming to the playoffs they're at their best, but this year they're coming to the playoffs kind of at their worst, and they need to turn things around for the Eagles. The next game is the Carolina Panthers versus the Atlanta Falcons. The Panthers won 44-38. The Panthers' leading passer is Bryce Young, who had 251 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Miles Sanders, who had 66 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Jalen Cocker, who had 62 receiving yards. And for the Falcons, their leading passer is Michael Penix Jr., who had 312 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher is Bijan Robinson, who had 170 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Drake London, who had 187 yards and 2 touchdowns. So in this game, both teams looked really great. Bryce Young looks like an absolute stud, and that's good for the Panthers because they did draft him first overall, and this is what they need from him to be playing extremely, extremely well. And that's what he did to finish out the season, and good for him because he was looking like a bust, like the Panthers might give up on him after 1.5 years, but no, he has really saved his career and looking like he could be one of the premier quarterbacks in the NFL. And he's especially looking good with this horrible Panthers team. And then the Falcons, Michael Penix Jr. looks pretty decent, which is good for the Panthers, or good for the Falcons, because clearly they're going to cut Kirk Cousins after the season. And then Bijan Robinson looks like an absolute stud, and has really been looking like the first-round pick he should have been. And Arthur Smith, I know he liked Tyler Algier better for some reason, but this was a really great game from Bijan. And both of these teams look like they're really turning their franchises around. And it sucks that the Falcons missed the playoffs, but let's be honest, the Buccaneers are a better team and did deserve the playoffs more. The next game is the Washington Commanders versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Commanders won 23-19. The Commanders' leading passer is Marcus Mariota, who had 161 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Marcus Mariota, who had 56 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was Terry McLaurin, who had 62 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Cowboys, their leading passer was Trey Lance, who had 244 yards. Their leading rusher was Rico Dowdle, who had 72 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Jalen Tolbert, who had 98 receiving yards. So both these teams played their backups for almost the whole game. This game kind of really didn't mean a lot for either team. The Commanders played okay. Trey Lance played pretty decent for the Cowboys. It's just going to be very interesting if Mike McCarthy keeps his job or not. Right now, it's looking like Mike McCarthy will not, and he'll go somewhere else. Because the thing about it is the Cowboys are on a different timetable than everyone else. Because everyone else just wants to get better each year and get close to the Super Bowl. But because Jerry Jones wants to win the Super Bowl before he dies, the Cowboys are on a win now, no matter what mode. And Mike McCarthy, even though he's been a great coach the past few years for the Cowboys, it's just probably not enough to keep him in the job. And so it'll be interesting whether he does or not. I think he should probably keep his job, and then the Commanders, you make the playoffs, you look good. Cliff Kingsbury, it's going to be interesting about him because he's looked really good. Even if Marcus Mariota in the offense has looked great. So, the Cowboys just finished a sad injury-riddled season, and the Commanders are looking really good. I don't think they'll go too far in the playoffs, but they are looking really good, at least for their year one of their rebuild. The next game is the Indianapolis Colts versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Colts won 26-23. The Colts' leading passer was Joe Flacco, who had 264 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Jonathan Taylor, who had 177 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Josh Downs, who had 94 receiving yards. And for the Jaguars, their leading passer was Mac Jones, who had 225 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Tank Bigsby, who had 39 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver is Brian Thomas Jr., who had 103 receiving yards. So in this game, the Colts actually looked fairly decent for most of the game. Their defense finally didn't collapse like they did last week somehow. And Joe Flacco is looking like he is a quarterback that can continue to play in this league. He might not be a starter, but he's at least a backup, and he looked pretty decent. Jonathan Taylor looked pretty good. They just occasionally struggled in the red zone, and that kind of ruined it for them. The Jaguars did start to make a comeback, and kept it pretty close, but overall, neither of these teams are that good. This game really had zero stakes, and overall, the Colts just won, plain and simple. I do think Shane Steichen should keep his job, and I think he probably will, although that call has not been made yet by the Colts, and it'll just be interesting how they do it. And then Doug Pearson for the Jaguars, same thing. He does have the resume. He did win a Super Bowl, and he did take Jacksonville to the Jaguars to the playoffs. But just overall, I don't know what they're going to do because this has been an unmitigated disaster of a season for the Jaguars. And I can totally see them firing them, and I can totally see them keeping them. It's going to be a real good question. The next game is the New England Patriots versus the Buffalo Bills. The Patriots won 23-16. The Patriots' leading passer is Joe Milton, who had 241 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Antonio Gibson, who had 41 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Kayshon Boutte, who had 117 yards and a touchdown. And for the Bills, their leading passer was Mitch Trubisky, who had 101 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Ray Davis, who had 64 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Curtis Samuel, who had 52 receiving yards. So the Patriots beat the Bills' backups. So that doesn't really say much, but Joe Milton does look pretty decent. And I do think maybe the Patriots can trade him to somebody, kind of like an old Jimmy Garoppolo situation, where Jimmy Garoppolo played pretty decent, and he got traded to the 49ers. So maybe Joe Milton will get some trade interest, because he looked great in preseason, he looked great in this game, although it was against the Bills' backups. And the big news of this game is Jerod Mayo did get fired from the Patriots. I hate firing a coach after one season just because I don't think that's enough to prove yourself as a good or bad coach, especially if a team this bad, because I don't think anyone had the Patriots doing anything decent. I think almost everyone ranked them as one of the worst teams in the NFL. But I think the only reason why Jerod Mayo got fired is because a guy like Mike Vrabel is available. I think if there wasn't a lot of great up-and-coming head coaching hires, there is no way Mike Vrabel or no way Jerod Mayo would get fired. But unfortunately, that's just the way it is. I do think Mike Vrabel will take that job, and who knows whether the Patriots will be good or not. Because you have to keep in mind, Mike Vrabel didn't get fired because he was a bad coach. He got fired because there was a disagreement in management. And so now the Patriots will get a good pick. I do think they should trade out and try to get more draft picks to try to rebuild the team. But overall, Patriots look good, and it was against the Bills' backup, so I don't know how much that means. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the New York Giants. The Eagles won 20-13. The Eagles' leading passer is Tanner McKee, who had 269 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading passer was Will Shipley, or leading rusher was Will Shipley, who had 32 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jahan Dotson, who had 94 receiving yards. And for the Giants, their leading passer was Drew Lock, who had 138 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Tyrone Tracy Jr., who had 59 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Malik Neighbors, who had 64 receiving yards and a touchdown. So in this game, it really felt like neither of these teams played that great. The Giants reverted back to them being terrible like previously. Last week was definitely a very fluky outlier of Drew Lock getting 5 touchdowns. And then the Eagles, their backups were in, but their backups are still playing pretty decent. Tanner McKee looked pretty good. And it's just kind of a shame that the Giants starters lost to the Eagles backups. It's just that that's kind of all I got to say about this. The Giants are horrible. They're not a very good team. And the Eagles backups are showing, hey, they can even be pretty decent. So even if Jalen Hurts misses next week against the Packers, which I don't think he will, I think he will probably play, they should still be in fine position, and the Eagles are going to be a tough matchup coming up. The next game is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the New Orleans Saints. The Buccaneers won 27-19. The Buccaneers' leading passer was Baker Mayfield, who had 221 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. The leading rusher was Bucky Irving, who had 89 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was Mike Evans, who had 89 receiving yards. And for the Saints, their leading passer was Spencer Rattler, who had 240 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who had 26 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Juwan Johnson, who had 80 receiving yards. So this was quite a shocker. The Saints were up in this game for most of the game, and it was pretty shocking because the Saints are just not a good team, and the Buccaneers really needed to win to make the playoffs, and they did. And I do think the Buccaneers deserved it more than the Falcons. And there was one play where right at the end to try to get Mike Evans over 1,000 receiving yards, the Buccaneers were up 8 with about 38 seconds left and just threw a ball to Mike Evans, and he caught it to get over 1,000 receiving yards. if I was the Saints and they knew what the Buccaneers were doing, because the Buccaneers could have knelt it, but they decided not to kneel it to throw in Mike Evans, I would put all 11 players on Mike Evans and just seen what they do. If they would have still tried it with all 11 players playing man coverage on Mike Evans with everyone else wide open. Just because everyone knew what they were doing, so I don't know why the Saints kind of allowed that to happen. They shouldn't have for pride reasons. And so it'll be interesting how the Buccaneers do. And they are going to face the Commanders, so it'll be a very interesting and good matchup. And the Saints, they're just a disaster. They'll probably get rid of Derek Carr. They're getting a new head coach, and who knows what they're going to do because they don't have the best draft pick to get a quarterback. So I'd probably run it back with Derek Carr and just hope with better coaching your team can be better and maybe get luckier with injuries. But overall, the Saints are kind of just a mess right now. The next game is the Houston Texans versus the Tennessee Titans. The Texans won 23-14. The Texans' leading passer was Davis Mills, who had 128 yards. Their leading rusher was Dameon Pierce, who had 176 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Robert Woods, who had 39 receiving yards. And for the Titans, their leading passer was Will Levis, who had 175 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 62 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Calvin Ridley, who had 76 receiving yards. So again, this is just kind of a sad, embarrassing game where the Titans backups couldn't be, or the Titans starters couldn't beat the Texans backups. Dameon Pierce had a really great game, and I do think he is a good running back. They just kind of didn't trust him, and Joe Mixon just passed him on the depth chart when they traded for him. And this will probably be the final game of Will Levis. The Titans have the first overall pick, and they will probably take a quarterback, whether it's Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward or somebody else. Maybe they'll trade back, but I don't think Will Levis got the fairest shot in the world, but because I do think Will Levis has shown enough flashes to at least get another chance to be like a Sam Darnold or somebody that can be a good quarterback. But overall, just a disaster of a season for the Titans. They signed a lot of aging veterans expecting to be one of the top teams, and they just weren't. They just weren't good. And then the Texans, I still don't believe in them. I still don't think they're that great. And I don't think they'll make it far in the playoffs or make the Super Bowl, but they did get a win, so they deserve credit for that. The next game is the Denver Broncos versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The Broncos won 38-0. The Broncos' leading passer was Bo Nix, who had 321 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Bo Nix, who had 47 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Cam Sutton, who had 98 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Chiefs, their leading passer was Carson Wentz, who had 98 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Carson Steele, who had 25 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Nico Ramigo, who had 48 receiving yards. So the Broncos needed to win this game to make the playoffs, and they played like it. Bo Nix was really, really good. He was basically perfect all day, and you can tell the Broncos needed to win this one. I do like the conspiracy theory that the Chiefs really wanted to lose this game because they would rather face the Broncos in the playoffs as opposed to the Bengals. And hey, maybe that's true, but overall the Chiefs just played their backups. They really didn't try to win. And I agree. I would rather play the Broncos than the Bengals because even though Bo Nix was almost perfect in this game, I do think the Bengals are better than the Broncos. And there's not much to say about that. The Broncos ended the Bengals' hopes. The Broncos finally broke their 8-year streak of not making the playoffs, and they finally made it. And could they be dangerous? Maybe. It's going to be tough to tell because Bo Nix has been kind of very off and on throughout the season, and he could just have a great game in the playoffs, or he could completely blow it. It could go either way. And this game meant nothing for the Chiefs, and they played like it. So it's good that Broncos can hang in there in tough games where it really, really matters to win. And again, they played almost perfect. Well, they did basically play perfect because they held the Chiefs to 0. The next game is the Arizona Cardinals versus San Francisco 49ers. The Cardinals won 47-24. The Cardinals' leading passer is Kyler Murray, who threw for 242 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Tony Jones Jr., who had 55 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Trey McBride, who had 65 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the 49ers, their leading passer was Josh Dobbs, who had 326 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Patrick Taylor Jr., who had 109 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Ricky Pearsall, who had 69 receiving yards and a touchdown. So in this game, it felt like the Cardinals starters versus the 49ers backups because the 49ers are so injured that it felt like they really didn't have a shot in this game. and they just played horrible. And the Cardinals played really good. I know there's talk about potentially moving on from Kyler Murray. I don't think the Cardinals will do that. They'll at least give him one more shot. That he played great in this game, but he's still way too inconsistent. And Jonathan Gannon, I think he's been a great coach so far this year. And he, with definitely more pieces around him and building a better team and a better defense, I think the Cardinals could be dangerous for the future. And that'll just be very interesting how they go because, they're so known for blowing it. But Kyler Murray just needs to play more consistent and definitely needs to play better. But overall, you got to be very happy if you're the Cardinals. And then the 49ers, at least you get a better draft pick. This has been a disaster of a season due to injuries. And just overall, not much to say about that other than the 49ers just need to get healthier. It'll be interesting what they do with Brock Purdy. I think they will sign him to an extension. I think maybe they should wait at least a year, but who knows what they'll do. We'll have to see. The next game is the Seattle Seahawks versus the Los Angeles Rams. The Seahawks won 30-25. The Seahawks leading passer is Geno Smith, who threw for 223 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Zach Charbonnet, who had 59 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Noah Fant, who had 63 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Rams, their leading passer is Jimmy Garoppolo, who had 334 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher is Ronnie Rivers, who rushed for 48 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Jordan Whittington, who had 86 receiving yards. So this is kind of embarrassing for the Seahawks because it was such a close game, and they're playing their starters versus the Rams' backups. The Seahawks did play great. Geno Smith did play really good. But again, it's starters versus backups. At least Jimmy Garoppolo played decent enough, whereas if Matthew Stafford goes down, he could be useful, but not much to say here. Geno Smith probably definitely earned him another year with the Seahawks, and that's kind of it. Like I don't know what to say because I know there's talk about replacing him, and again, I think he's one of those low end starters, high end backups. And the Rams, they kept the game close, and it was a close game despite not playing anybody of significance. And that's kind of that for that game. The next game is Los Angeles Chargers versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Chargers won 34-20. The Chargers' leading passer is Justin Herbert, who threw for 346 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is J.K. Dobbins, who had 63 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Quentin Johnson, who had 186 receiving yards. And for the Raiders, their leading passer was Aiden O'Connell, who had 214 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Alexander Mattison, who had 20 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Jacoby Myers, who had 123 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, the Chargers played really good, and the big narrative of this game is this is Quentin Johnston's breakout game. He struggled with drops all this year and last year, and has really looked like a bust and horrible. In this game, he played really, really well. Yes, it's against the Raiders, who are really not good at all, but he played really well, and he deserves credit for that, because maybe he's saving his career and can be a good 1-2 punch with Vlad McConkey. And then the Raiders, they're just terrible. They're going to fire their coach, Antonio Pierce. He might have fans in the locker room, but he's just not that guy. He's not a coach. He's not a good coach. Aiden O'Connell, I think he's proved himself to be at least a decent backup, but he's not a starter. They have no offensive line. Alexander Masson feels like he's running for like 2 yards a carry. This season. He's been terrible, but at least Jacoby Myers has been really great, and Brock Bowers has been a stud. I get it. Jaden Daniels is going to win Offensive Rookie of the Year, but Brock Bowers at least needs to be in semi-consideration for that. So this game was overall mostly meaningless for both teams. The Chargers are trying to get higher seeding, and the Raiders are just trying to stick with the Chargers. But just overall, this game didn't mean anything, but the Chargers are looking great and building momentum for the playoffs. The next game is the New York Jets versus the Miami Dolphins. The Jets won 32-20. The Jets' leading passer is Aaron Rodgers, who threw for 274 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Breece Hall, who had 57 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Davante Adams, who had 88 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Dolphins, their leading passer is Tyler Huntley, who had 227 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Devon Achane, who had 121 yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Jonnu Smith, who had 56 receiving yards and a touchdown. So the two stories of this game is Aaron Rodgers of the Jets. This might be his final game for the Jets, and this might be his final game of his career. Aaron Rodgers looked really good. He had an interception that was a tip pass on the first play of the game, but other than that, he looked great. And he's definitely shown that he's still a starter in this league, and he can still be pretty decent. It's just that it kind of feels like the whole Jets organization is cursed and everything went wrong. And he definitely, over the past several weeks, has proved himself to the point where I think with maybe a little bit better coaching, if you have someone like a Ben Johnson or somebody like that, or a great defensive mind, maybe a Brian Flores, you can take this team to a Super Bowl or the playoffs. Or if a team just wants a stopgap player, like I'll get to the Vikings in a minute, I think Aaron Rodgers definitely can be there. Or if he just doesn't want to go through the hassle of going to a new team and he just wants to call it a career, this was a great game to end it on. And the Dolphins, they're just okay. I do feel bad for them because Tua went down and their offense looked like nothing without Tua for most of the season, and that was just too many losses to make up at the end. Mike McDaniel, I do think he is a decent head coach. The problem is, I think he's a really good offensive coordinator, and I think he's really good for Tua. But his problem is that he cannot make adjustments. Like when Tua went down, he could not change the offense to fit Tim Boyle or Tyler Huntley or any of the other quarterbacks that they had, but or Skylar Thompson. And so, like, if you look at like Matt LaFleur, he went undefeated with Will Levis because he's like, okay, Will Levis is not Jordan Love, so we're going to completely change everything to make Will Levis look good. Whereas with Mike McDaniel, he's like, no, we're going to try to force Skylar Thompson or Tim Boyle or Tyler Huntley to beat Tua, and they're simply not. And so so if everything's right, I think he's a really great coach, but just he struggles making adjustments. So I do think the Dolphins should keep him, at least give him another shot. And then the big story out of this game is Tyreek Hill. He announces he does want off the Jets, or sorry, off the Dolphins. And it does make a little sense. He has definitely been going downhill, but also I think you can blame that a little bit on Tua being injured as well. But he's had quite a few drops. He really just hasn't had the production he has had in previous years. Again, I think you can blame a lot of that on Tua going down, but also he's just kind of regressing as a receiver. And we did know that in the fourth quarter, he kind of took himself out of the game and benched himself, and he's just done. So it's going to be interesting what team he goes to and what he's really worth. Because is he a number one receiver anymore? Maybe. Or he could just be a high level number two because he is getting older and he is definitely slowing down. But he will be off the Dolphins and get traded probably. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets traded like a couple weeks before the draft for a top pick or something like that, or like a second round or maybe a third. We'll see. That's going to be very interesting where Tyreek Hill goes and where Aaron Rodgers goes. And the final game of the regular season was the Detroit Lions versus the Minnesota Vikings. The Lions won 31-9. The Lions' leading passer is Jared Goff, who threw for 231 yards, one touchdown, two interceptions. Their leading rusher was Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 139 yards and three rushing touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had six receptions for 77 receiving yards. And for the Vikings, their leading passer was Sam Darnold, who had 166 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Cam Akers, who had 65 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Justin Jefferson, who had 54 receiving yards. So this game really felt like the collapse of Sam Darnold. Early on, both defenses looked fairly decent. The offenses couldn't really get anything going. Goff threw kind of two bad interceptions and nearly threw a third one to Andrew Van Ginkel. But the story is Sam Darnold. He collapsed mightily. There was a lot, like, you do have to get a little bit of credit to the Lions defense, but mostly I don't even think it was the Lions defense playing well. There was so many plays where Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison was wide open, and Sam Darnold just missed them. And in the red zone, they had 4 red zone trips, and they could only get 2 field goals off of them. And there was a couple of plays where one was where they had 2 times where Jordan Addison was wide open in the end zone, and Sam Darnold didn't even look his way. And then there was one where Justin Jefferson was wide open in the end zone, and Sam Darnold just overthrew him. Like, maybe it's the pressure getting to Darnold, I don't know, but he just did not look good at this game. And Justin Jefferson looked off in this game. It felt like every single catch was bobbled. He really struggled maintaining his feet. Like, he'd catch it and then have to go to the ground to maintain control of it. He couldn't get any yards after the catch. And those two just were not playing well at all. And the Lions, they got the 1 seed and the bye week, so congratulations to them. And just overall, the Lions defense, again, played fairly decent, but I think it was more the Vikings offense playing bad. And then Jahmyr Gibbs looked really good, like an absolute stud, and it should only get better if David Montgomery comes back, / when David Montgomery comes back. And Jared Goff just needs to clean up the football and stop throwing these interceptions. So for the Vikings, it'll be interesting what they do with Sam Darnold. In my opinion, This is why I said always from the very beginning, I think the Vikings are a good team. I think they have a good defense. Justin Jefferson is probably the best receiver in the NFL. Aaron Jones is a top 10 running back. And Jordan Addison is one of the best number twos in the NFL, and they have a decent offensive line. So I think as long as Sam Darnold just didn't play completely horrible, the Vikings would be a playoff team. So I think you can have someone like J.J. McCarthy do exactly what Sam Darnold did. And if you don't feel comfortable moving from J.J. McCarthy yet, sign an Aaron Rodgers for pretty cheap and try to win a Super Bowl with him. I think you do not give Sam Darnold a mega contract after only one good year and having such a great team around him, and especially like this in high pressure situations where he felt like he fell apart a little bit. So overall, the Lions did great. They got the 1 seed. They'll get a bye week and will only be healthier. And the Vikings, I think there are quite a cause for concern. So that's what happened in Week 18 of the NFL season. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money, and I'll see you on the next one.